Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mohit, and on behalf of Aalto University, I welcome all of you to our second HAIC Talk of 2022. As is customary, I'll very briefly introduce what is HAIC and what it does. So HAIC stands for Helsinki-Aalto Institute for Cybersecurity. It has three goals. To foster joint research between University of Helsinki, Aalto University, as well as the industry in the capital region. So we often work on research projects with um, various companies which are active in the cybersecurity field. Then the second reason why HAIC was initiated was that Finland now has tuition fees for students who come from outside the EU, and both the universities were concerned that this would affect the number of applications we were getting. To promote students still to come from abroad and specialize in cybersecurity, we reached out to our partners and asked for donations. And thanks to Huawei, F-Secure, and SSH, we are able to provide scholarships to students who want to specialize in cybersecurity. The third and the final, let's say, goal of HAIC, which is why all of you are here today, is that we have a public outreach program where we invite experts from all over the world in the field of cybersecurity to give us some enlightening talks about a variety of different topics. So it's we try to make sure that it's as broad as possible. And we'll have a talk today. But before I tell you more about today's talk and introduce our speaker, just a quick reminder, we actually have our first physical event tomorrow after almost 2 years. So we have our demo day in the computer science building tomorrow. So hopefully I'll get to see many of you face to face. With that, I guess it's time to tell about today's lecture and our speakers. So today's talk is going to be super interesting. It's about not attacking protocols or systems or machines. It's about attacking the brain. And I think with, let's say, lots of this online misinformation, it's a very timely topic. And we have the honor of having Professor Franziska Rosner as the speaker for today. So she's a professor at University of Washington, and she co-directs the Security and Privacy Research Lab. Her research is broadly focused on computer security and privacy for end users of existing and emerging technologies. She studies like security for augmented reality, for IoT platforms, for sensitive user groups, online misinformation and disinformation. And she's very distinguished speaker, so we are lucky to have. She's received NSF Career Awards. She has received the Emerging Leader Alumni Award from University of Texas at Austin, a Google Security and Privacy Research Award, and she received her PhD from University of Washington in 2014. I won't take any more time, and with that, I would hand over the controls to you, Professor Rosner.
Yeah, sounds good. Let me share my screen. Does that look right?
Yes, it does.
All right. Great. Thank you so much for the invitation and the introduction. I'm really excited to be here. It would have been nice to visit in person, but I hope that I'll be able to do that in the future. So again, I'm at the University of Washington, where I co-direct the Security and Privacy Research Lab. And I'm excited to share some work today that we've been doing over the last few years in what sound like quite different technical areas, but fall together under this umbrella of thinking about not just vulnerabilities in technical systems, but thinking about ways in which the human brain is a target of attack or manipulation. So as we all know, living our lives increasingly online, especially over the last 2 years, the technologies that we're using today inundate us with content from all directions. There are social media, there are ads on social media and on websites, there are countless websites, apps, et cetera. And as we look to the future, this is something that we can expect to only increase with the dawning of the metaverse and augmented and mixed reality technologies, and wearables and IoT and smart homes and everything else. So we live in a fascinating time. And of course, these technologies come with tremendous benefits. That's why, those of us working on these technologies or early adopters of these technologies are excited about them. But as with everything, they also come with new and serious security and privacy risks. And so our work in the Security and Privacy Lab at UW tries to anticipate these technologies and the risks that come with them, as well as understanding the landscape of what's going on with current technologies and the needs that people have and in using those to help us ultimately design better technologies in the future. The types of issues that we look at, as I said, include not just technical exploits of systems, but also the ways in which humans are exploited through misuse of these systems. So this includes problems like misinformation, which of course is something that over the last few years has been increasingly a topic that all of us contend with and probably see in our daily lives online. This includes, misinformation about really serious and impactful topics like elections or COVID. And this misinformation comes not just through social media posts or news articles on low quality sites, but also through ads that are disseminated through our various ad ecosystems. I'll talk about this a bit more in a big chunk of my talk. And again, as we look to the future, as we look towards the metaverse and augmented and mixed reality technologies, we see some hints of how these things can go wrong there. So for example, if some of you may have been or still are Pokemon Go players, it's still an early example of what augmented reality might look like. But even there, we saw early examples of how this can go wrong, not even necessarily maliciously, but accidentally. So people distracted by using these technologies, having vehicle accidents and so on. And I think what's maybe interesting to me about these different examples is that, again, they're not coming through technical exploits of the system. They're often coming through ordinary use of the system or misuse of the system, but the system is working as designed. For example, I'll talk a lot in the first part of this talk about the online ad ecosystem, which is designed to target people with information, allow advertisers to disseminate information, appear on third-party sites, and so on. This is how the system was designed. There's no technical exploit occurring, but we live in this online world now. We're all inundated with this content, and of course, not all of this content is good. And so I'll talk a bit about this umbrella in around different technical contexts. So online advertising is the first one. I've mentioned this already. Also, of course, mis and disinformation on social media is a big topic that many of us are thinking about and familiar with. And finally, I'll look to the future. I've mentioned a few times augmented and mixed reality technologies. That's an area that our lab has been working on for about 10 years or so. There are many, many interesting and challenging security and privacy problems there, but for the purposes of this talk, I'll focus on this perspective on attacking the brain. So across all of this, our lab leverages a broad array of methodologies to do this work. So that includes both looking at existing systems like the web, doing web measurement, threat modeling and anticipating future systems like augmented reality, and then also across the computing stack. So thinking both about the needs of users and doing qualitative work, interviewing people, all the way to thinking about how we should be designing these systems, building prototypes, evaluating systems, and so on. So throughout the talk, you'll get sort of a flavor of these different methodologies, giving us perspectives on these problems. So let's dive into part one, and I'll talk more about misleading and other problematic online advertising on the web. So online advertising is a topic that the security and privacy community, including our lab, has looked at significantly over the last 10 or 15 years. And often the way that we've looked at this is by considering the technical mechanisms of online tracking and targeted advertising, and thinking about especially the privacy concerns that come from this ecosystem, the way that advertisers can track you across the web, the way that individual advertisers can learn things about individual users, and people's perceptions about this. But what we've been doing in our work in the last few years is looking not at those underlying technical mechanisms, but actually at the content that is being spread through these ads. So you'll see lots of examples of bad ad screenshots throughout this talk, but here's an array of that gives you a sense of what we're thinking about. This includes not necessarily or not just content that is on the extreme of what is clearly problematic or even illegal, like dissemination of malware through ads or outright scams or phishing, but content that is in kind of a gray area that we've been trying to define through our work that is problematic in different ways that I'll talk about, but things that are clickbait or that are exploiting people's emotions, that are sensational, that are disgusting in one case here, things that are misleading, misinformation, and so on. I'll show you a bunch of different examples throughout the talk. And these are kind of in this gray area. They're not security exploits traditionally, but they are inundating people as they browse the web. And I'll give you some stats from our web measurements. So our work in the last few years has really focused on the user impact and the user visible content of these ads, to understand how this is contributing to the information that people are exposed to as they browse the web. The way we got into this research direction was actually not so much through the advertising angle, even though we had been studying this for about 10 years, but thinking about misinformation. And so one thing we realized as we were observing some low quality and known misinformation sites was that a lot of the bad content on those sites was actually coming from ads. And so in the broader misinformation research community, we think a lot about the misinformation that's appearing on social media or as first-party content on sites. But of course, a lot of the content on the modern web, perhaps not so much for viewers of this talk. I imagine there's a higher than average use of ad blockers among the audience here. But for many people, a large fraction of the content that they see on news and media websites is ads. So for example, on this screenshot that I've shown you, you may or may not have noticed that these articles down here are actually ads. Now they are labeled. There's the Taboola feed at the top. If you don't know Taboola, it's kind of a recommendation-based advertising company that serves a lot of the ads that look like this. They're also labeled as sponsored, but you could be deceived. They look like news articles. They look similarly styled to the actual news articles above them. And these types of ads are called native ads because they are embedded in the page looking like the first party content by design. And so we embarked on this research direction with the question of specifically around misinformation. What's the role of ads like this in spreading misinformation? What are the news article like ads that are spreading misinformation, and what are the sites that they lead to? For example, one hypothesis we had was that on low quality misinformation sites, do these ads lead people further down a rabbit hole of misinformation? And so this was our initial motivation, but in fact, what we found is that these low quality ads are so prevalent all across the web, not just on low quality sites, but also on reputable news and media sites, and that they come with a wide range of problematic content, not just misinformation. So over the last few years, we've been looking at this ecosystem, trying to understand both conceptually, what are the types of problematic content that appear in these ads, understanding user perception of these ads, in addition to just our researcher-informed perception, and then doing a variety of web measurements to understand how prevalent problematic content is in these ads and who are the players, the advertisers, the ad platforms, and the host websites that are contributing to this content. So let me give you a bunch of different examples of this spectrum of problematic content. And this comes from analyzing data from a bunch of our different measurement studies. I have a PhD student, Eric, in particular, who has He's just defended his PhD, and he has spent many hours. I think he could write an interesting memoir about all of the ad content that he's looked at manually as part of his PhD. So that kind of manual qualitative analysis work is where these examples and this taxonomy comes from. So we see on the one hand, things that are annoying but not so problematic. So for example, content farms, these are ads that leverage people's curiosity. They're sensational, they are kind of have a gossipy flavor, and they take you to not real information. They take you to pages that include low quality stories with just a bunch more ads. So these are trying to get ad impressions, increase ad revenue. That's ultimately the case for all of these, but some of them are problematic in other ways. So there are a class of ads like insurance advertorials in particular, but also other advertorials. These often have the flavor of looking like articles, but actually being advertisements. And they can be quite deceptive. So it's not just that the ad looks like an article link, but when you click on it, it looks like you've come to a news site. It's written as though you're reading a news article. There might be some kind of hidden label that this is an advertorial, but in the end, it will pivot to trying to sell you some sort of product. And these sometimes use especially manipulative techniques, like they will use kind of phishing style techniques in that they'll use the logos of mainstream reputable news sites on the advertorial page, but it's on, it's on some random domain. Likewise, we see these for, especially for supplements, it's sort of unregulated health supplements that are being sold. And these especially leverage these kind of shocking, gross techniques. We see a lot of the gross images in the context of these ads. So these are all things that kind of look like articles, but are actually selling things. We also see other types of problematic content, like manipulative ad designs in the top left here. I'll talk a bit more about this when I talk about political related ads. But we see many examples of these types of opinion polls that look as though they are trying to ask you to vote and give some information or otherwise kind of leverage your political motivation. But of course, they're just trying to get you to click, provide your email address to sign up to a mailing list and so on. We also see misinformation, as we had been looking for originally, often in the form of these native ad clickbait ads like the Biden ad that's shown here. And these are often not outright misinformation, so they're not falsifiable. So this one is viral video exposes something fishy in Biden's speeches. That's not really a falsifiable claim, but the underlying article is vacuous and it's contributing to a certain impression of a political candidate through content embedded on news and media sites. I'll come back to this when I talk about election ads a bit later as well. And then finally, we see other types of manipulative UI design, this kind of dark or manipulative patterns, like this potentially unwanted software download. It makes you think that you need to download something to use the page, or ask you to install a browser extension and so on. So there's a spectrum of content here, from kind of low quality and annoying to explicitly manipulative, asking you to install software. And the perspective we've been taking in this work is that even this low quality content that is not necessarily even against any policies, it's not illegal, it's just, at best it's useless, is actually problematic and manipulative, especially in the context of being a large fraction of the content that people see on the web. So this what I've shown you was based on our researcher qualitative analysis of this content. One of the works that we did in this space was to understand users' perspectives on this. And the long story short, those essentially align with the researcher-based taxonomy that we initially created, but gave us some interesting insights into the variety of perspectives among people. But what we did in this study, I'll skip the details, but we essentially asked people to label ads that we had collected from a sample of top websites, and then clustered those labels to identify different clusters of problematic ads. And here are the two most disliked clusters, very much like the ads that I showed you before. There's the cluster of scammy and untrustworthy ads that people labeled largely as deceptive. And these often include software downloads, these health and supplement ads, and advertorials. And then this cluster on the right are these distasteful and gross ads. These are also often clickbait, often deceptive, but these are more of the gossipy style human interest news ads. These content farms, listicles, also include some health and supplement ads. And again, these are, if you think about these in the framing of exploiting the human brain, that is exactly, what these ads are doing. So how prevalent are these types of problematic ads on the web? Again, if you're using an ad blocker, you might actually be surprised at how prevalent these ads are. We've done several different measurements of this in different contexts. So we have now a big measurement infrastructure set up where we can crawl the web, pull the screenshots of ads, collect them along with metadata about the ads, and then do a combination of automated and manual analyses, so that we're continuing to do this work in new contexts, especially around, for instance, historical events and so on. I'll talk a bit about our work around the US election. But some of our first work was just about understanding how prevalent these are in general. So this graph I'm showing you here was based on the same user labeled data that I just showed you. So this was a random sample of ads from the top 3,000 sites on the web. And these are the opinion labels from our participants. So a given ad can be labeled with multiple opinion labels. So these are not mutually exclusive, but you can see that 20% of the ads on these top 3,000 sites were labeled by our participants as clickbait. So that's actually quite a significant fraction. Again, these red bars may be overlapping, but over 10% of the ads were labeled as deceptive, which again, perhaps having gotten this far into the talk, you're not surprised by that, but I think is a substantial fraction of the content that people are seeing on the web. Likewise, actually, before this study, our first measurement study looked at news and media websites. And this is when we still were focusing specifically on misinformation. And we had this hypothesis: are the ads on low quality news and misinformation sites worse than the ads on mainstream reputable news sites? And the short answer was they were not as different as we expected. So these are results from that measurement, looking at the fraction of ads on news and misinformation sites that were classified as problematic with our researcher-created taxonomy. We also look at the homepage of the site compared to an article page on the site, because those often have different designs. And we can see that especially the article pages have huge fractions, like over half of the ads on those pages are what we classified as problematic based on our researcher data. Now, there's some caveats with this data analysis or this data collection, which is that we are crawling for these ads rather than based on real user profiles. We are doing some work now where we're analyzing data from real user profiles, so that there may be some inflated problematic ads here as news websites or ad platforms detect us as a crawler or having low history in our profile. But nevertheless, even as a potentially an upper bound, these are large fractions of ads that are problematic, considering that the real estate of these news sites consists largely of ads. So let me talk about one more measurement study that we did here, which was specifically around the US election. So the US election, of course, was an incredibly contentious, highly advertised event, record numbers of dollars in advertising spending and so on. And so around this time, both before and after the election, we ran our crawler and collected ads on almost 800 news and media websites. And we ran our data collection both before the election and then after the election. And there were many events that happened still after the election, including discussion of potential manipulation of the election all the way through the storming of the Capitol in January of 2021. And so we collected ads throughout all of this time. And we looked at specifically the political ads on these sites. And so here, when we say political ads, we took a broad definition of this, looking not just at official political ads from official political campaigns, but all ads that were leveraging kind of the political climate and political topics in their content. So that includes a lot of content that is not appearing in, for example, Google's and Facebook's ad transparency efforts, because those only include official political ads from official campaigns or organizations. So I'll give you just a couple of examples of the types of problematic ads we saw here. If you're interested in many more details, of course, you can read the paper, which I've mentioned at the bottom of the slide. One of the biggest categories of misleading and manipulative ads are these opinion polls. So we saw many of these. Here's another example on the slide. And these are, again, leveraging people's political motivation to get them to click. They're often phrased in kind of an incendiary way. And what happens when you click on them is that they actually, of course, are not real polls, but they usually will say, to complete your vote, please enter your information here. They ask for personal information, including email address, which will then usually lead to signing you up to some political mailing list or other mailing list, and perhaps disseminating your information in other ways. And those mailing lists then continue to inundate you with manipulative and potentially problematic content. We also saw a lot of kind of exploitative political products that are often using these classic techniques of, free product, but then exorbitant shipping and handling, the hidden fees and so on. And these were often Trump-related products. Like there's this example here of this special $2 bill. And we saw many kind of low quality products, especially, again, related to Trump-related memorabilia. And then finally, and I think to me, this is the most fascinating and the most concerning category, because it's a little bit less overt, are these political clickbait ads. So again, there's this example of this viral video exposes something fishy in Biden's speeches. There are many, many other examples of these. And, I think what is tricky about these is that they are not falsifiable claims. You can't take them down for misinformation. Another example on the other side of the political spectrum will be something like, you won't believe what Trump said to his son, or something like that, kind of implying something problematic about Trump's relationship with his sons. But when you read the underlying article, there's actually no such thing there. It's just some list of facts about Trump's children or something like that. And so these are contributing in this highly polarized political environment where people are making decisions about the election. These are contributing to the information that people are seeing as they browse. So you see enough of these ads about Biden, you may not even remember that these came from an ad. You maybe didn't click on it to read that the underlying article doesn't actually really say anything interesting. But what you might remember later is, I saw somewhere there's something untrustworthy about Biden. It's contributing to my sense that Biden is untrustworthy. And these are not regulated as political ads in the same way that official political ads are. And yet there are many, many of them that are exploiting this political and polarized environment, really just for ad clicks. They're not trying to spread information, and yet they are spreading information. So I think this category, I think, concerns me personally, especially. Finally, one last example. This is my favorite one. I don't know if this is intended to be manipulative or if this is intended to be funny, but this is sort of looks like a classic phishing example. Again, I don't know if this is a joke or if this is targeting users that may be using older operating systems with alerts like this, but this is an actual official political ad run by the Republican National Committee that looks like a Windows, older version of Windows alert dialog. Okay, so stepping back, I think what really draws me to this line of research is, as I've said, the extent to which ad content, and especially problematic ad content, plays a key role in our online information ecosystem. As we think about misinformation, as we think about political content and so on, it's not just the first-party content on the pages. It's not just what people post on social media. It is this extensive ecosystem that allows anyone to place third-party content onto sites that people otherwise trust. And so there are implications, for us as researchers, of course, for the ad platforms, and also for policymakers as they try to draw the line in this gray area where it's very difficult to draw the line. So we have a lot of ongoing and future work in this direction, both understanding better the implications of these ads on people, the targeting of these ads, what we might do about them from a technical and policy perspectives. And as I mentioned, we're doing continued and longitudinal data collection, also in collaboration with Consumer Reports, the Consumer Reports Digital Lab. We're developing an ad archive to continue to collect this data, add some transparency to the ecosystem, and also make it available to other researchers. Okay, so let me just check the time, which I cannot see from this view. Okay, sounds good. So let me move on to the, how do I think it stopped, it paused my screen sharing. Let me restart that. There we go. So let me move away from ads and talk more about the misinformation and disinformation that is posted on social media explicitly as not first-party content, I guess, but not looking at the advertisements. And of course, social media is a huge platform where people not only do socializing, but also receive and learn about political and other news information. So we know from various Pew polls and otherwise that Facebook, among others, is a huge source of information and news for about a third of Americans, and even this was almost 2 years ago. So chances are this has increased, and of course all sorts of other platforms and all sorts of other information. So there are many, many research questions to ask about misinformation and news on social media, including how do people interact with these posts? How do they investigate posts? If they choose not to investigate posts, why don't they do so? Essentially, what are people's mitigation strategies and consumption behaviors around potential misinformation on social media? And then ultimately, what is the role of the platform? What is the role of the social media platforms in designing for or really against this type of content on their platforms? How can the social media platforms both prevent this content from spreading in the first place, but given that this content does exist, how can they help people be better consumers of information on these platforms? So there are different approaches for answering these types of questions. We can directly study the platforms themselves. That can, of course, be challenging, although sometimes there are opportunities to collaborate with the platforms or study data that's been made publicly available or available to researchers. We've done that with some data from Facebook. We can also study people. So we can do qualitative or quantitative studies of people's self-reported behavior on social media, or directly observe or measure their behavior on social media. For example, we can leverage data protection regulations that require allowing people to download their own data. We can run studies, for example, where we ask people to download their data and then donate it to us for research purposes. We've actually recently done a study like that I won't talk about today, but looking at TikTok. Or we can do studies with sort of models, kind of modeling people's behavior, the spread of information on these platforms. So we've looked at this from a number of different angles, as have many other researchers, of course. And I will just dive deeply into one of the works that we did a couple of years ago. Actually, kind of just before COVID, we did an in-depth qualitative study where we met people in person and observed their interactions with their Facebook and Twitter feeds to really try to understand how are people using these platforms and how are they thinking about misinformation as they are confronted with information and posts on social media. So this is a kind of classic qualitative study where we interviewed and observed people's behaviors, and we were really looking at not quantitative methods. So we're not trying to understand what fraction of users do some behavior, but really dig deeply into what are the different behaviors that people do, what are the kind of different themes that emerge from looking really in depth at a smaller number of participants. So our methodology included both initially kind of interviewing people to understand their social media usage in general. And then we observed them as they scrolled through their real social media feeds. And this distinguished this study a bit from previous studies that had looked at, for example, research users scrolling through researcher-created feeds. The reason that this was often done in previous methodologies is that the researchers need some control of the content that users see to ensure, for example, that there's some misinformation as part of this. So the way that we did this in our study is we actually asked people to install, or they used our laptop, which already had installed a browser extension that actually changed the appearance of their feed in the following way. The browser extension injected into their feed known misinformation posts. So posts that we had selected that covered a variety of different types of misinformation, ones that were more text heavy, ones that were more image heavy, and so on. And it injected those into their social media feeds. It did this just at the user interface level. So the browser extension took some random existing posts in their feed and then kept the poster, but changed it to look as though the content posted had been some misinformation. So there's, of course, some ethical questions about doing this study. People could not actually share this. So sometimes people within the study would actually, use their social media in a way where they would share something or comment on something. These posts were just visually changed, so they could not actually share these. We also debriefed them at the end of the study to show them which posts had been injected and so on. But the purpose of this was that there was some known and controlled actual misinformation on their feed that we could observe their interaction with, but that it was in the context of their real social media feed with the real people they follow and so on. After this scrolling session, we then did an exit interview where we asked them specifically about misinformation. We had deliberately not mentioned misinformation in the pre-interview so that we could observe their interactions without priming them to look for misinformation and be suspicious. And then finally, as I mentioned, we debriefed them on the purpose of the study and the actual purpose of the browser extension that we had them install. And of course, we had them also uninstall the browser extension at the end. So the types of misinformation that we included through our browser extension covered a variety of different topics like politics and health. As I said, a variety of different post types, including articles, memes, just directly text. And these were all posts that or stories that had been debunked through Snopes. So the summary of this work is that it gave us a sense of what do people do when they see a post, and particularly what do they do when they see a post that we knew was misinformation. And so this flowchart summarizes our findings. Again, this was a qualitative study, so our goal was really to kind of generate this flowchart, not necessarily to learn how common these different behaviors are over a more generalized population. But I'll walk you through this flowchart and highlight some of the behaviors that I found particularly interesting. So when someone sees one of these misinformation posts, what did they do? Sometimes they chose to ignore it. That wasn't necessarily because they thought that it was misinformation, but because they used other cues to decide what to focus on as they're scrolling their feed. So sometimes if a post is too long, has too much text, people just didn't even read it. They used cues from the engagement, like how many people had liked or reshared this post to decide whether it was interesting enough to look at. If they identified it as an ad, they also ignored it. Or quite often they just decided it wasn't relevant to them, like they weren't interested in politics or something, so they just scrolled by. On the other hand, people sometimes took our misinformation posts at face value, and they did that for a number of reasons. They used cues like the person who posted it, who they might trust. They might say like, oh, this is my sister-in-law, and she tends to vet the content she shares, so I just trust this, or I trust this person or this group on this topic. but sometimes people used, cues that are more along the lines of the human brain as an attack surface. Various cognitive biases, like confirmation bias, like if the post aligned with their political views, they were, perhaps more likely to believe it, or they were overconfident about their sense of whether misinformation would target them. So, for example, one sentiment that we heard that perhaps many of us, ourselves sometimes feel, is that misinformation is not so much a problem for ourselves, but for others. Like maybe I am good at identifying misinformation, but others are not. Or maybe it is politically differentiated. Like one of our participants said, I tend to associate fake news with the political right, and I don't follow any accounts on the right, so I don't expect to see much misinformation. And so, while it may be true that certain types of misinformation cluster around certain political views, it's not the case that this is just an issue on the political right. And so this type of, overconfidence isn't going to happen to me, is something that we probably all should take a little bit of caution with. Then there's this middle of the flow chart, which is when people are skeptical about a post. Why are they skeptical about a post? Sometimes it's because it just seems too good or too bad to be true. It perhaps looks photoshopped. The context was somehow strange. This was actually something that I was surprised about. It was not an intentional finding of our study, was that because we had modified their feeds, so it looked like, their sister-in-law was posting misinformation, people would clue in on this context. They had surprisingly strong mental models of who in their feed would post what. So they might notice, like, this seems like a weird thing for this person to post. And so that might be one reason that they were skeptical. Now, even being skeptical, people often still chose not to investigate, or described, in their more general social media experiences, choosing not to investigate. And that is often because people are just burned out. Some of this content was political, and in, around early 2020, people in the US were really burned out on political information and political misinformation in particular, or they weren't in the mood to do kind of an investigation of some content. They weren't interested in this topic. They didn't have time, or it was hard to do it on a mobile device. People might be scrolling while waiting for the bus, and then doing an investigation of, a Google search, learning more about some topic that they, of a post that they had just scrolled by, is just not something that they were going to do right then. And so, this speaks a little bit to, again, potentially what is the role of the platform in helping with this, but also perhaps limiting our judgment of people who are not choosing to investigate all of these posts. There's this context collapse on social media, where you maybe went there to look at what your friends did over the weekend, and then there's this political content. You weren't trying to read the news. It was there, but nevertheless, of course, it can have an impact. To give you one sense of, why people don't have time, there's just so much content here. So, for example, one participant told us that they probably spent less than 8 seconds on a tweet before moving on. And you can probably see that in your own behaviors too. You kind of scroll through to see what's interesting, and that is not conducive necessarily to deep investigation. When people did investigate, they did use techniques of the type that we might recommend as misinformation researchers. So, for example, evaluating who posted it, or evaluating the source. For example, the difference between a reputable mainstream news organization and some organization that the user has never heard of. Comparing with other sources, so sort of triangulating, doing a Google search, trying to understand what are other sources saying about this claim, or often using comments or other kind of peer-to-peer features, like what are people saying in the comment thread about this? What is some trusted person saying about this? Not just, what is the domain of the site? So a variety of different strategies here. And these are all great strategies. And one thing that I would caution, also for ourselves, as we maybe think like we understand how these networks work, we understand misinformation and so on. I think one observation is that we do this less than we think we do. We maybe know, or people describe to us in the interview, what are the right strategies for investigating when you do investigate. But in practice, often you're spending 8 seconds on a tweet, you think that misinformation doesn't apply to you. And so, or just, again, fairly, we only have so much attention and time to spend on this. So even if we know the right strategies to use, we're maybe not always using those. And so one important question here is, what is the role of the platform in intervening when someone has posted misinformation or low quality information? How can the platform be designed to help people do all of these things better? And so we asked a bit about this in our interviews as well. So for example, Facebook has, I believe still has, this little information button on news articles that tells you a bit more about more context about the source. And what we found was people didn't even know this button existed. Some of you may be surprised that this button exists. So it's perhaps a nice idea to give more context about the source, but in practice, people are not using it. We also, and we studied this more in a follow-up study, we also look at misinformation specific interventions. So for example, when something has been checked by one of Facebook's fact checkers, Facebook will give this sort of false information label. They've iterated through various designs of this label, but this was one iteration that you can see on the slide here. It grays out the post and tells you that this is false. It also warns you again if you try to share this and so on. So this is post specific. There have also been a number of kind of more generic misinformation interventions from the platforms. For example, this voting information center dialogue that comes up on Facebook when it detects that there's any election related content. Likewise, Facebook, Twitter, and others have done this around coronavirus information. Anything that mentions vaccines or so on, there's sort of a general dialogue here about vaccines. We did a quick study about this right around the beginning of the pandemic, when these platforms put up all of these COVID misinformation related banners. And long story short, what we found is that these post-specific interventions are generally more helpful and more effective than the generic banners. This is perhaps not surprising since they're more specific to the specific post. But unfortunately, these post-specific interventions are actually very rare. They only occur when, for instance, Facebook's fact checkers have definitively fact-checked something as false. So it has to be a falsifiable statement. It has to have already been viral enough that the fact checkers were engaged and so on. So instead, what actually dominates over these platform interventions are off-platform or peer-to-peer debunking strategies. So rather than 5% of the people we surveyed having seen these false labels, almost half of them will conduct web searches. As we saw in our more qualitative study, people use the comment threads and so on, or people use what others peers are saying on the platform. So there's one example here from a law school colleague of mine who is alerting people to this common type of misinformation that occurs around hurricanes, where there's a shark in the streets, in the flooded streets. And this image recurs over and over again. So a direction that we're exploring now in a big NSF-funded project through something that's called the NSF Convergence Accelerator, that is focused on not just basic research, but actually product creation and impact, is leveraging and supporting these kinds of peer-to-peer interactions rather than the platform, kind of clinical platform interventions. Okay, so let's take a look to the future. As you may have seen in the news, or perhaps through your own early adopter status with some of these technologies, emerging augmented reality and mixed reality technologies are becoming closer and closer to part of our daily interaction with technology. So what we're talking about here are various types of technologies where there is computer-generated content, often visual. That's usually how we think about it, but could also be haptic content or audio content that is overlaid on the user's perception of the physical world in real time. Now, there's a bit of a spectrum from, augmented reality, mixed reality to virtual reality, where there's less, the user themselves is, of course, still in the physical world, but they don't see the physical world per se. But we're often thinking about these technologies that might be used in the context of the user's regular interactions in the physical world. They might be walking around, they might be having a meeting, they might be driving, and these technologies are developing to add content, both for entertainment purposes like Pokemon Go, but also for informational purposes, like helping people navigate through augmented reality and car windshields. So these technologies have advanced tremendously over the last, couple of decades, and especially recently. Facebook, and changing its name to Meta, of course, is all in on this vision. And our lab has been looking at these technologies for the last 10 years, initially more conceptually, anticipating what will be the new security and privacy challenges that arise when these technologies come. And lately, more practically, looking at the actually available, augmented reality, mixed reality toolkits and technologies. So this is kind of an exciting time for these technologies, but it's also a scary time. And it's a time where we can, as security and privacy researchers, still have some impact on how these technologies are designed. So let's talk a bit about what this technology is and what can potentially go wrong, especially as we think about the human brain as an attack surface. So in our work, we've often conceptualized these platforms with this kind of information pipeline that I'm showing on the slide here. We have on the one side, of course, the physical world that is sensed by the system through many different sensors. One thing that makes these technologies unique is just the rich sensor data that they are always collecting about the world and about the person using them. Those inputs flow to the applications that are using them in various ways. So for example, Pokemon needs to know where the ground is in the world so that it can put a Pokemon on the ground. You can imagine applications that need to know where the people are, that need to recognize the people to label them at a conference, with the reminder of when you last interacted with them, and so on. Those applications then do something with that data. They provide some content, and then they create sensory output that is displayed to the user, either through audio, visual, or haptic feedback. There are many different places in this pipeline. We can also, of course, make this pipeline more complex as we think about all the different features that are arising. But there are many different places in this pipeline where we can think about things going wrong and malicious actors either manipulating or exploiting technical systems or users and so on. The way we've thought about this in our work is usually that the platform itself is trusted. That, of course, might not always be the case, but in our work, we've thought about how do we design the platform. So the platform is, maybe created by Google, Microsoft, Facebook, new startup, et cetera. And the question is, how should this platform be designed to mitigate risks from untrusted applications? So this is a similar threat model to your smartphone. You maybe trust Google or Apple as the operating system platform creator, but you don't necessarily trust all the third-party applications that you might install from the App Store. So there's a variety of risks that we've looked at in our research and that others have been looking at increasingly as well. On the input side, we need to worry, of course, about privacy with all of this rich sensor data. Even 10 years ago, one of the reasons that arguably Google Glass failed was because of concerns about privacy. Google Glass itself actually does not have as many privacy implications as people feared. It's not really an always on camera in the same way that some of the emerging technologies or future technologies might be, but it tapped into this visceral concern that people had about people bringing cameras, people wearing cameras on their faces that might be always on. It's very different than a smartphone that if you're walking around with a smartphone camera up, that's not the typical use of the phone. So a lot of questions about how do we design these platforms to minimize these privacy risks, given that they do need a lot of access to sensor data to do useful things. They need to understand the world in order to display things contextually in the world. So we can think about, again, how do we design the platform to minimize the sensitive data that goes to applications while still allowing useful interactions. So for example, if applications need to know only where the walls are in order to place content on the walls, that's very different than the application needing to have access to all of the raw sensor data. So similarly, in some ways to our smartphone platforms, how can we limit the scope and also the use of the permissions that applications might have to sensor data? A lot of our work, and this is what the area I find more fascinating because it's more new, is around the output that these applications create. So applications, again, create virtual content overlaid on your perception of the physical world. The dream and the vision is for this to be useful. But of course, especially this far into this talk about manipulating the human brain, I think you can probably start to think about ways in which this can go wrong if the application is malicious or even just buggy. So for example, if you haven't seen this hyperreality concept video, it's a 7-minute video or so. It's kind of a dystopian future vision of this. I'd recommend watching it. But I think this is not what we're hoping to see when we wear our augmented reality technologies around the world in the future. And so we can kind of extrapolate from the problematic ad content that I showed you at the beginning of the talk to what this might look like unchecked in the future of the metaverse. I think this is not what we hope to see. So a lot of our work has focused on trying to map out what might these types of threats be and how do we design the platform to mitigate them while still having the benefits of the technology. So for example, if we take this car windshield AR application as an example, we might think about applications that obscure or modify the content from another application. This is maybe a bit more traditionally what we think about with content attacks on the web, like an application that might block your view or change what the speed limit is that's created by another application. It might obscure or modify important real-world content, so prevent you from seeing that there's an oncoming car or a pedestrian. And again, this could happen adversarially from an application that is, trying to target you as an individual or so on, or this could happen just from a buggy application. And finally, and this is the most like attacking the human brain and its functions, applications might disrupt the user physiologically, like by startling them or by exploiting certain cognitive biases or visual adaptations. So for example, if you're scared of spiders, you might squint for a moment or close your eyes, but a malicious windshield application that has a spider that appears in your view. Even if upon inspection, this spider is clearly not a real spider, but a virtual spider, your instincts might have, already reacted to this before you've had the chance to cognitively assess, like, oh, this is not real content. So, these are just some examples, but I think as we see from the ad ecosystem or misinformation on social media, I think we need to anticipate that exactly these types of things, if they can happen, they will happen. So likewise, we can think about the output side, how do we design the platform to mitigate against this? How do we, essentially, what's the API for applications to display content? What are the policies that a platform might be able to enforce to prevent certain types of manipulation? For example, an application that covers up too much of a user's screen, perhaps that's a problem. Or how does a platform handle multiple applications that are trying to display at once? These are all tough questions. They echo questions we've seen on previous platforms. Like on the web, we have similar questions like, how do you allow third-party content to safely be embedded inside a page? So we have iframes and the same origin policy that isolates this content. These solutions from former platforms don't translate exactly in this context because we don't just have isolated two-dimensional windows, boxes inside boxes like we have on the web. With augmented reality, we imagine immersive content that is integrated with our view of the physical world. And so having something inside a little box is not going to necessarily allow us to fulfill that vision. We also need to think about, kind of multiple applications modifying our view of the world at once. You might have your Pokemon game, but also your conference application and your pedestrian highlighting application, or whatever it may be. And how do we integrate all of these in a way that is secure, is actually a significant system design challenge. And then finally, we also need to think about multiple users using these platforms and interacting not just in the virtual worlds together, but also in the physical worlds. If we don't see the same world, we're in the same physical space, ordinarily as humans, if we're in the same physical space, we see the same things, but with augmented reality, we may not. You and I might share some private content that the two of us can see, but someone else cannot. How do we think about doing access control between users and also helping users in their kind of social interactions, given that this is not aligned with what our brains expect about the physical world? How do we do kind of content sharing and access control and so on, both from a technical mechanism perspective, but also from the kind of user-facing UX perspective. To kind of start to close out the talk and to give you some specific examples related to misinformation in a way, let me give you a couple of examples from a user study that we did a few years ago, where we brought pairs of participants into the lab to both use a HoloLens and then do various activities, where we wanted to understand kind of just their baseline expectations and concerns about augmented reality. So these were people who had never used a HoloLens or similar before. And we learned a lot about their expectations about what other people would see, what virtual content would do, and so on. One kind of amusing anecdote is that the very first thing people often do is that they start to put virtual content on top of each other or on top of the researchers. And this is, of course, done in jest, but you can see how this is, this starts to poke at some potentially tricky questions, like who is allowed to change what I look like, to others in my physical environment? Who's allowed to put content on me? Who's allowed to put content on my house? All of these questions. But this is one thing that's kind of funny, is that I see this happen all the time. When people first use this, they just start to put things on people's faces. I've seen this even when I've given talks in venues with distinguished law professors, and I've brought the technology for them to try out. The first thing they do is they start to put content on each other's heads and giggle about it. So there's just something that people want to do this. When we ask people, about the concerns that they have with these technologies, especially after using them, they bring up these types of concerns about what happens when you can't trust what you see about the physical world. What if someone's driving and someone throws a digital object at them, and if it appears to go through the windshield, people might react as though that was real. Or what if you can change what somebody looks like? What if you can change what your spouse looks like without them even knowing about it? I think we can think of plenty of kind of dystopian science fiction stories that we'd like to avoid this future turning into. Or different kinds of examples of how you might use this maliciously. Like maybe if I wanted to hide a physical object from someone, I could hide it behind a virtual object that would make it hard for them to move. You can think about other modalities as well. Like what if I put some sort of audio object in your physical space, and you actually can't locate that virtual object that's creating that sound. So all sorts of ways that you could dream up, once the technology is there, how somebody might misuse this. And to bring this full circle to misinformation and even the native ads that I showed you at the beginning, I think one thing that really surprised us about this study is that even though this technology is imperfect, like the HoloLens that we used at the time had a very small field of view. So you actually only saw content in kind of the center of your vision. And the content is very obviously virtual. There's no mistaking it for an actual physical object. And yet, people's brains very quickly adapted to it. People would kind of subconsciously step around virtual objects as though they needed to do that, and so on. And people were surprised, at how realistic this felt, even when the technology was not yet perfect. And so, we can extrapolate this to even more realistic technologies in the future, what will this look like when we all see kind of different versions of the physical world? What will this look like when technologies like deep fakes are more advanced, when the misinformation and the manipulative content that we see is not just embedded in third-party ads on the web, it's not just embedded in our social media feeds, but it is actually embedded in our physical world. What will this look like, and how can we prevent the future from looking like this? So stepping back, and I'd love to take some time to answer your questions or hear your thoughts. But stepping back, in my mind, all of this work is connected by a couple of key questions. One is, how can this content on these different platforms manipulate us? What might people believe based on this content? Or what do they believe based on this content? And what does this look like, not just in today's ecosystems, but also in our future ecosystems and our future technologies? And then as technology designers, those of us, who are designing or have the opportunity to inform the design of future augmented reality platforms or today's web ecosystem, how can we design these platforms and ecosystems to be more robust to these types of risks where, third-party content is exploiting essentially the human brain for profit or for fun or for, all of the classic motivations for computer security and privacy risks. So just to wrap up, this work was done with a bunch of great collaborators, mostly at the University of Washington, both student and faculty collaborators, and you can see them all on this slide. And with that, I will stop talking, and I would love to I'd love to answer any questions you have, hear your thoughts. I will take the slides off, but please feel free to also reach out to me via email or otherwise.
Excellent. Thanks so much for the talk. I will enable the possibility to unmute yourself and ask questions directly. But while we wait for the audience to warm up, I had actually a couple of questions. So maybe my first one was related to this, let's say, misinformation and disinformation, and it in some ways relates to, well, not directly, but in somewhat relates to this phishing, and let's say at several organizations where I've worked in the past and even now, we have this. It's a big business of sending these training emails, and they seem to be getting much better at it. And obviously there is a scoreboard of colleagues and how they are performing, and what's your success ratio of detecting how many of those emails were actually, let's say, phishing emails. So I wonder, is there like a, let's say, financial business model that we actually train users to do the research, especially for cases where it matters? Like if someone doesn't believe in vaccines, I guess the financial downside is harder to prove than, let's say, if someone clicks a malicious link on a phishing email.
Yeah, it's interesting. And actually, this is not. Yeah, I wonder what the equivalent of the phishing email training might look like, in the future metaverse. That's, in some ways it's also might look like social engineering training or something like that. The person who tries to follow you into the building or something like that. But yeah, no, I think the core of your question is really important, which is what is the role of the different stakeholders in this? Like, what is the role of educating users about how to assess this type of content? What is the role of the platform in preventing this type of content in the first place? How do we do the education? How far can we go with the education? What is the responsibility of people versus what is the responsibility of the platforms? I think those are really important questions, and I think there's some of both. And some of the work that we're doing, I mentioned this kind of peer-to-peer misinformation stuff. I think part of the vision there is that a lot of this work is actually being done between peers. So people are, we've, as part of that work, we've done a bunch of interviews with people who take it upon themselves to kind of be anti-misinformation officers in a way. You know, they care passionately, for instance, about vaccine uptake. And so they have developed strategies to talk with people in ways that are effective. You know, they don't come in and yell at people and correct them, but they are trying to educate. And so, you know, I think there are, yeah, there's so many different skills that are involved in all this. And I think it's a good question of, you know, how do we teach these skills, and what's the responsibility? Who do the various responsibilities fall on?
Right. I won't take my second question just yet. There's like several raised hands, but before we move on to the other questions, I'll paste a link to an article in The Guardian, which is about how Finnish primary schools are actually teaching kids to fight against fake news. Hopefully it's interesting. But I see, Janne, you have your hand raised, so go ahead.
I was muted. And thanks a lot for the great talk, Franzi. I was really interesting, and I really liked how you put together all your work on the ad space and then moved to all the way to the augmented reality. So really fascinating. So I was wondering in the middle, when you were talking about the decision, you had kind of a decision tree on the ads, sharing posts online. And if I understood it correctly, there was that people would accept things at face value and then decide to share it or so on. So, but I was wondering that, did you see any kind of this kind of behavior that people just went like, this probably isn't true, but I'll get some likes for sharing this, or I'll troll my friends, or something like that? So
I don't think that came up in our study, but that is, you know, that could be the design of the study. Like they had a researcher looking over their shoulder, asking them about how they do things. So there's definitely this participant response bias where, you know, you want to seem like you do a good job at this.
Right.
So it may be that, you know, our study in that form wouldn't have surfaced it. I mean, it is certainly the case that one of the challenges here is that this type of content gets more engagement. That's why, you know, that's part of why it's working. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there are people who do this, you know, they like, oh, I'm just asking questions style of misinformation. I'm not making a claim, like it wouldn't this be interesting? Don't you think we should ask these questions? So I'm sure that's a factor, but yeah, it didn't come up in our study.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot again joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, Janne. Valtteri, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the great talk. So general question, maybe on the latter part, more about this kind of what usually called the privacy paradox, that people are very worried about privacy, but then they quite easily sacrifice it, or at least that's the kind of the myth. So have you noticed something about around this? Can you comment based on your experiments?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me think if I have something specific from our experiments to say. I think, you know, the privacy paradox in my mind is, you know, kind of highlights the responsibility that we should place on platforms, or perhaps regulators, or both, in that often I think the reason that it's a paradox is that the choices are not reasonable. Like if the choice is don't use this technology that everyone is now using, or give up all of your data, those are not reasonable choices. You could see how a reasonable person might choose to, you know, seem to not care about privacy because they care more about, you know, the benefits that they get from the technology in terms of being connected with their communities, and, you know, or even not necessarily having the choice. I imagine that I don't know that I have something specific from our experiments to shed light on that, but I think that is something that will come up again in these contexts. I mean, certainly with Meta being the company to push the metaverse, the question about privacy is not, in our threat models, we've thought about we trust the platform, but the question of do we trust the platform is, with our privacy and so on, is one that is not an answered question or doesn't have an obvious answer. So yeah, our experiments don't speak directly to that, but I think it is something we will continue to run into again. And I think the core of it in some ways is the misalignment of incentives between the various stakeholders. And the challenges between, and we see this in the ad ecosystem as well, the challenges between free content versus paid content versus paid through your data and so on. If we could redo the web without the advertising ecosystem, I don't think we can do that at this point, and maybe we could never have done that. But that's a question to ask about the metaverse, for example, or future augmented reality technologies. Do we want, Facebook's Meta's business model is ads. Is that what we'll have in the metaverse? At the moment, they say no, but I don't think anyone trusts that will always be the case. And I think perhaps what they would argue is that, well, that might be the difference between the technology being accessible and available to many people versus being a luxury item. And so I don't know, these things are challenging, but yeah, it's a great question.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Valtteri. Next, we have EM. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, hi there. Thanks for the mic. I'll actually just start my video. Oh no, the host has stopped it. Am I able to start the video so you're now speaking with the disembodied voice?
Sure. I think it should be possible now.
Oh. Thank you. Hi there. Thanks for the talk. I had a couple of questions around, actually just the one question for now. Like, we saw many examples of misinformation targeting individuals, and I wanted to ask you a question about this, even though what you were speaking about earlier about the ad-supported future of the internet almost took me on a tangent. I want to ask, how would you say the threats of misinformation differ between private individuals and, say, commercial/industrial targets?
That's interesting. Yeah, I think, we kind of group all of misinformation, disinformation together. At least I did in this talk, but certainly there's value in splitting apart the different impacts and the different actors and the different motivations, because you might have different defensive strategies for them. So for example, the impact for individuals may be more along the lines of individual health outcomes. Well, I guess, in the topic of vaccination, those choices are not necessarily individual, but decisions that individuals make. However, those decisions can have broader impacts, not just in the vaccination case, but also in the election case. Like, impacting people's votes has a broader impact than on the individual. That said, some of these things, especially some of these ads that are not, they might impact individual health decisions and so on, like the buying of supplements or the believing of certain information. You also asked about kind of corporate or other misinformation. Again, it is perhaps a bit about what is the power of the entity that is acting on the information, and what systems can they impact through their actions. That there's also other types of impacts. There's financial impacts for individuals who might fall for scams. There's psychological impacts of just being inundated with all of this content. It's, I think if you think of that that screenshot I showed from the concept, the augmented reality concept video with all of the different content, like that's not a world that I want to live in. I don't think that my mental health would do well under that. So there's also all those types of impacts. There's also, as we think about the adversaries and their goals might be financial, to make money. That's what we see in a lot of the ad ecosystem. It's not necessarily that they're trying to spread information or impact votes or anything like that, though we certainly sometimes see examples. They're just trying to get clicks. They're just trying to make money. And that's actually really useful to identify that as a motivation, because the strategies you might take to defend against that are different. Because if you can shift where people make money, or where people can and can't make money, that will be useful for an entity that's just trying to get ad clicks and make money. That will not help against a concerted adversary that is trying to impact the election. And so it's useful to kind of break down, the question you asked, and also related questions of, what are the goals and what are the impacts, because what we might do is different depending on, where the weak spots are of the adversaries.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
All right, I think this will be the last question, and it's from the chat from Martin. So question regarding the problematic ads. Can you elaborate a bit on what kind of policy work or technical solutions could tackle this problem, and what avenue of mitigation do you see as a possibility the most fruitful going forward?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So I think there are a combination of solutions that can help with this. The dream solution would be we move to an economic model of the web that does not rely on crappy third-party content to pay for reputable news sites. I think the path to that is unclear to me. I think in the shorter term, as we think about the way I've come to think about this, in not so much in the context of privacy, but at least in the context of content in ads, is that if we embrace that ads are going to be a part of the ecosystem, then I think we can, think about what do we want this content to look like, and it's not just it's a usability question. It's a user experience question. And I think there's a role for ad networks to differentiate themselves potentially on, the quality of the content. And there's increasing concerns about this. Like, you may have heard of the term brand safety before. Brand safety in the advertising context is about reputable brand ads appearing on bad websites. So for example, pick your favorite, like Coke doesn't want to appear necessarily on, some misinformation site. So we do see some reputational pressures like that. I think towards that, there's a role for researchers and policymakers to work towards transparency. That's kind of what we're trying to do with consumer reports. One challenge in the ad ecosystem is that it's extremely opaque. So the ads that I see are different from the ads that you see. Understanding what ad campaigns are running and targeting potentially vulnerable individuals, and how that works from a privacy and financial perspective and so on, that's all extremely opaque. So I think there's a lot of value in just shedding light on some of these things, because there can then be reputational pressure, if not explicit policy pressure. I think it may be challenging for policymakers to say, for instance, in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission can act on certain things like outright scams that are scamming people out of money. Those are things that fall under what the Federal Trade Commission might look at and prevent and or punish. But things like non-falsifiable clickbait, that's probably in the realm of, free speech values would not allow us to have government entities take that down. But that doesn't mean that transparency and reputational pressure on some of these things might not put some pressure on ad platforms to do more content moderation towards not just what's illegal or outright problematic, but what is what is distasteful and impacting the user experience. So I think there's some value in that. I think there's also still value in thinking from the policy. Now, I'm not a policy expert, so this is just hopeful and not realistic. But the role of policy on things like especially these explicit manipulative patterns, I think that fits into a larger discourse around dark patterns and manipulative design patterns in general, where there's kind of essentially a power imbalance between the individual and the content creator. So there may be some role there. And finally, I think there's a role, kind of a more technical role for kind of in the ad blocker setting. What might it look like to not block all ads? Maybe as a user, I want to financially support the websites I visit, but I don't want bad ads. So maybe I can have an ad blocker that just blocks those, or that warns me about those, or kind of taking some inspiration from some of the misinformation interventions that we see on social media. What might that look like for ads? That's actually something that we're also looking at. So I think basically in all these different places of the ecosystem, there are some things that can be done, both technically or content moderation wise, but also in trying to align the incentives better through reputational pressure and so on. But it's certainly challenging for reasons including the current misalignment of incentives and the fact that a lot of this content is in a gray area. Like, it's distasteful, but it's not illegal, and you can't really make it illegal. So, and you probably don't want to. So yeah, it's a great question, and I think the answer is there are multiple facets, but there's probably not a silver bullet solution. And I think partly just raising awareness of it can help put some pressure on the ecosystem. And looking at the chat, yes, I can confirm that the black cat is real.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks a lot. I'm sure everyone is clapping with me, or at least using the emojis. Let's not forget Franzi joined us very early in the morning. I suppose it's like 6 a.m. that you started in Seattle. So really appreciated that you could join us virtually. We hope that someday you're also able to actually come down to Helsinki and visit us. But with that, I think, Nina, we can stop the recording.